Did you know that the book of Revelation is actually a temple story? It's a temple story. We're shown the heavenly temple in the book of Revelation. We first see it in Revelation chapter 4, where we have this throne of God and the 24 elders seated around the throne. In Revelation chapter 5, we see not only the throne and the elders. We're introduced to the idea of prayers being offered. In Revelation 8, we see that these prayers are being offered in golden bowls of incense and received by an angel who places them on a golden altar. So we have temple furniture similar to the things that we read about in the Old Testament. A golden altar of incense, a throne, which is actually symbolized by the ark in the Tabernacle of Moses and the Temple of Solomon. In Revelation 15, we also learn that the heavenly temple is actually a tabernacle. It's a temporary structure. And of course, we know that's true because later on with the New Jerusalem coming down, there is no temple. So when we see God sitting on his throne in heaven, we're actually looking at a temporary dwelling place. It's a tabernacle. So Revelation actually gives us a temple story. And of course, if you've got a temple, you're going to have priests, and we have the 24 elders who are seated on thrones. They are priests and kings and judges and worshipers. They have harps and golden bowls. They're seated on thrones. They wear golden crowns. They actually carry all of these different roles, these different offices. So this is a temple story. We see various groups of believers who are depicted as part of different courses of priests coming into the heavenly temple. In the Old Testament, God told Moses, be sure and make the tabernacle just like you saw the pattern on the mountain. So that's in Exodus 25, verse 9. Make the tabernacle and design its furnishings according to the pattern that I'm going to show you. The writer of Hebrews comments on that in Hebrews 8:5. The place where they serve, that is the priests, is a copy and it's a shadow of what is in heaven. And that is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. So one of the early questions that I asked myself when I was delving into the book of Revelation, specifically when I got to Revelation 11 that talks about the temple of God, and John is measuring the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there and leaving out the outer courts. And there's a part of me that goes, oh, okay, this is the temple of God. I've heard people say, oh, this is the temple of the Antichrist. This is the temple he's going to want to have built so that he can go into it. But when I read the text, it actually says that this is the temple of God. Now, when God authorizes the building of temples, he always tells people what it's going to look like. So he gave the pattern to Moses. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, we're told that David was given the plans for the temple and its buildings and the storehouses and upper rooms and inner rooms and for the room for the mercy seat. The plans contained everything David had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, for the surrounding rooms, and so on. And all this, said David, all the details of this plan the Lord has made clear to me in writing by his hand upon me. 1 Chronicles 28, verses 11 through 13 and verse 19. So it's clear to me that God tells people what he wants his temple to look like. If it's the temple of God, we're going to know how he wants it to be built. So when we get to the temple of God in Revelation chapter 11, there are people who say, yeah, the temple has to be built. Of course it has to be built. It has to be rebuilt, and then the Antichrist will go into the temple. And a lot of people just sort of bypass this principle that God will tell you what this is going to look like. He is the one who's going to authorize it, and he's going to give you some idea of what to look for, what kinds of things are going to be in that third temple, the tribulation temple. So a lot of Christians are unaware They haven't really made a study of the temples of God. And there are many, many temples. God talks about his various temples in the Bible, and I've done a video series called The Temples of God. But what I want to do here is I just want to show you an example of how not all temples are alike. They're not alike at all. And I'm also going to give you some screenshots of comparisons of the Tabernacle of Moses, the Temple of Solomon, and Ezekiel's temple, which is something that's going to be built during the millennium, or something very similar to it. So when God gave Moses the plan for the tabernacle, basically what we have is a tent, and that's what this squiggly line is right here. It's a tent. That tent, this Tabernacle of Moses, lasted for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. The tabernacle itself was divided into two sections. We have the Holy of Holies, and we have the Holy Place. This Holy of Holies is where the ark was kept. This is the place where the high priest could only enter one day of the year. That was on the Day of Atonement. This squiggly line right here is the veil that was before the ark, and immediately in front of the veil was the golden altar of incense. This area here was where the priests could go in every day, and they ministered to the Lord in this place right here. And there's also the table of showbread with the 12 loaves of bread that would be replaced weekly. And then we have the 7 branched golden menorah. Immediately outside of the door there is this laver. It's a place where the priests would wash. And right here was the altar of burnt offering. So these two items right here are made of bronze. The ark, the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the menorah are all of gold. Gold speaks of divinity and glory and so on. Brass speaks of judgment. All right, so that's Moses' tabernacle. This was the system that was set up for over 400 years. All right, now some of you are aware that when the Israelites were fighting the Philistines, this is around the time of Samuel, Eli was the priest. The Philistines were winning, and the Israelites said, we need to take the ark into battle with us, and if we do, we're going to win. So they took the ark out of the Holy of Holies, and they took it into battle, and of course the Philistines took it. They captured it and went from one city to another, and people got tumors and mice and all kinds of terrible things, and so they actually sent it back to Israel again. And by this time David is king, and David wants to bring the ark to Jerusalem, to Mount Zion. That's what he did. The ark never again went back into this Tabernacle of Moses. It never did. The priests would go through the motions, but God was not home. He was actually in a different tent. This is a tent with just the ark in it, and this is where King David would worship the Lord with singing and music and prophesying, and there was nothing else there. Just the ark, at least nothing else that we know of. And there were no sacrifices associated with this tabernacle, the Tabernacle of David, which is this one right here. Actually, there were two systems in place. The Tabernacle of David, where people worshiped God in his presence as kind of kings and priests, because David was a sort of an example of a priest king. He wore a linen ephod, and he worshiped in God's presence and wasn't smitten. Wasn't smitten. God loved David and his worship. And this is where we learn about a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. This is where we learn and read about in the Psalms, and also in the book of Hebrews chapter 13, about a different kind of sacrifice. It's the sacrifice of thanksgiving, the sacrifice of praise, the sacrifice of giving and caring for other people. So eventually, David got the instructions for this next temple that we're going to look at, and that was Solomon's temple. And Solomon's temple was huge. It was so much bigger than either the Tabernacle of Moses and obviously than the Tabernacle of David. So what happened was these two, the Tabernacle of Moses, the brazen altar here, and the ark were brought into the Temple of Solomon, so that this temple did not exist anymore, and neither did this one. They were basically swallowed up into the Temple of Solomon. Now, in the Temple of Moses, there was only one table of showbread, only one golden menorah. When you get to the Temple of Solomon, you have 10 tables of showbread, 10 golden menorahs. You have everything made out of gold on the inside. And this is huge, and it's not a tent anymore. Now it is a permanent dwelling. You also have the brazen altar outside, which was huge. And you have this laver. It's called a sea. And this was so deep, you could fit people in it. I think it was like 7.5 feet deep. And this particular laver here is something we're going to talk about. This Temple of Solomon here obviously is very different than the Tabernacle of Moses, than the Tabernacle of David. It's different than what we read about in Ezekiel's temple. So what is the tribulation temple going to look like? Do we need to have 10 tables of showbread and 10 golden menorahs like Solomon's temple had? What is going to be in the tribulation temple? Well, this is actually something we can know because according to what we read in the Bible, the earthly temple is patterned off of the heavenly temple. And if this is the case, every temple that we see, whether it's the Tabernacle of Moses, the Temple of Solomon, or the Tabernacle of David, that's what it looks like in heaven. Okay, the earthly temple is a reflection of what's going on in heaven. So when we get to Revelation is a temple story. We actually see the temple in heaven. We actually can know what things are going to be in that temple. And one of the things that I just want to say right here at the outset is there are no animal sacrifices taking place in the heavenly temple. There's no brazen altar. There's no altar of sacrifice. So what that tells me is that the temple that will be built during the tribulation is not a temple that has sacrifices. So there's no need for red heifers. There's no need for priests to be trained to offer these kinds of sacrifices, because right now in our heavenly temple, we have the Lamb who was slain and resurrected, and his blood has been applied. There is no need for blood atonement anymore. All that's taken care of. And it doesn't matter what the Jews think needs to be done. The reality is what we see in the book of Revelation. So the tabernacle of God in heaven is going to be reflected in the temple of God in the holy city. There are some things that are not described as being present in the temple of God in the book of Revelation. One of those things that's not there is the table of showbread. The table of showbread had the 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, that isn't there. That isn't there. Why isn't it there? It's because in the church, we are neither Jew nor Gentile. We are all one in him. It's a new race of humanity. Another thing that's not there that I talked about earlier is the altar of burnt offering. There is no brazen altar of burnt offering. And another thing that isn't there is the veil. There's no veil that separates God from his royal priesthood. When you go into Revelation chapter 4 and you read about the throne there in heaven with God seated on the throne, and around him are his 4 living creatures and the 24 elders. They're all right there in the presence of God with nothing between them. What this leaves us with are actually 4 pieces of furniture. And like I've said before, we already know that this is a tent. It's a tabernacle. Revelation 15 verses 5 and 6. After these things I looked, and behold, a temple, that is a naos. It's the place where God dwells. It's where the ark is. Behold, the temple of the tabernacle, the skene, which is a tent, of the testimony in heaven was opened, and out of the temple came 7 angels having the 7 plagues. So what we see here is that this is a tent. The heavenly temple is a tent, and that there's an entrance into it, and there are things on the outside of it. If we were to draw this, we're going to draw this as a tent. And we're going to have the Ark of God more or less in the middle, sort of like in the Tabernacle of David. And we're going to have the 24 elders seated around the Ark of God. And the other thing we learn about something that's in this heavenly temple that we read about is something called a crystal sea. Okay, we're going to look at that in just a minute. But the crystal sea is before the throne of God. So that would be all in here around the throne of God. There is a door, there is an entrance that people go in and out of. There is also a golden altar of incense. And there is an angel that stands before this altar. And when the 24 elders offer their bowls, their prayer in golden bowls of incense, it's offered on this altar right here. Golden altar of incense before the throne of God. Also, before the throne of God are the 7 spirits of God. So what we have is somewhere in here is a menorah. The spirits of God are connected with the throne of God. Okay, so we've got a menorah, we've got this crystal sea, we have an altar of incense, and we have the ark. We have the 24 elders seated around the throne. When the angels that have the bowls of wrath come out of the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven, what we see are people outside over here. There's people who are standing around a sea of glass, and it's also mingled with fire. What is that? What is that? I've had some theories about that along the way, and I think I finally just had an aha moment about what this place is right here. We'll be looking at that in just a minute. What this is this is the outer court. Okay, this is the outer court of this tabernacle right here. And there are people, lots of people that we see standing around this sea of glass mingled with fire. So my question that I had was, we know that there's a crystal sea around God's throne, and we know that there is a sea of glass with fire. And originally what I thought was that the sea of glass with fire, and this crystal sea right here were actually kind of the same thing. But they're not. They're not the same thing at all, because this one's outside in the outer courts, and this one here is on the inside before God's throne. So the question I had then was, this crystal sea right here, what is that? What is the crystal sea? Revelation 4, 5, and 6, and from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, and before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. All right, so Ezekiel 1, 22 and 26 through 28 also talk about an expanse that gleams like crystal, only it's above the heads of the 4 living creatures. So I'm not going to go into detail, but I have done a video on Ezekiel's wheel within a wheel, the 4 living creatures of Ezekiel 1 and the 4 living creatures in Revelation. And my conclusion about this crystal sea that was spread over the heads of the living creatures is that it's like it's the sky. It's a window. Through this window, symbolically speaking, God views the earth. Okay, this is how he watches us. In Exodus 24, 9 and 10, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. They saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. So I think what they were seeing was God in heaven. I think they were like transported, and this crystal pavement, like sapphire, clear, was like the sky. And remember, these are symbols, okay? These are symbols. The crystal sea seems to be equated with the sky, the sapphire firmament over the earth, which is God's footstool. Isaiah 66:1. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. What is the house you will build for me, and what is the place of my rest? So we might think of the sky as not being part of the earth, but it actually is a part of the earth. It's where the birds fly. It's part of the whole earthly system. So this crystal sea that's before the throne of God, that's in proximity of the seven spirits of God, symbolized by a menorah, this is all part of what's inside of the heavenly tabernacle. There's another place, though, that's outside the tabernacle. And there are people standing around a sea of glass mingled with fire. And this has been perplexing to me. I couldn't figure out, how do you get a sea of glass mingled with fire? What is that? We got fire and water. Is the water burning? I mean, I'm starting to think kind of literally, and I'm like, wait a minute. No. Let's just look into where we first see a sea that is in front of a temple. The laver in the Tabernacle of Moses was not called a sea. It was made out of mirrors and so on, where people could see their reflection. It was made out of the mirrors of the women who ministered that were made out of brass or bronze, so highly reflective. When we get to Solomon's temple, though, we have a laver that's actually called a sea. So I'm going to just give you some information from some sources that are in my notes here. The first one is from Got Questions on the bronze laver. This second laver, this one right here, is much larger than the one in the Tabernacle of Moses. It was 15 feet in diameter at the top and about 47 feet in circumference, with a depth of 7.5 feet. And you can read about that in 1 Kings 7:23. The depth of the water in the bronze laver seems to indicate that the priests completely immersed themselves in it. Okay, so that sort of reminds me of baptism, where people are immersed in water. Here's something else. When Solomon built the first temple, he included 10 lavers, 5 on the north side of the courtyard and 5 on the south. All were used for rinsing the articles used in sacrifices. Okay, so they were not actually in front. There were 10 lavers, 5 here and 5 there, in Solomon's temple that priests used for washing with regard to the sacrifices. But for the ceremonial bathing of the priests, Solomon constructed a large ornate bronze laver called the sea. 2 Chronicles 4:1-5. Interestingly, no lavers are mentioned in the second temple built by Zerubbabel in 516 BC. And that's also from Got Questions. So why a bronze sea in Solomon's temple, but one made of crystal in the heavenly temple? Well, let's talk about the meaning of bronze as a metal. And this is from One for Israel. Gold is symbolic of God's kingship, his glory and holiness, and silver represents redemption, especially when you consider lives exchanged for silver coins. The holy place of God's presence is lined and coated and covered with gold. So he talks about how gold is on the inside of the temple and bronze is going to be on the outside. The altar on which animals were sacrificed to atone for sin, and the enormous sea or laver of pure water to cleanse and purify. They were made of bronze. Before a priest could go into the holy place, into the presence of God, first they needed the blood. Okay, and that was what the brazen altar did. There was the sacrifices. And then they needed to have the water where they would go into the sea of bronze and cleanse themselves. This is all part of Solomon's temple. Atonement and cleansing from sin, to be covered and clean. The blood for atonement, the water for cleansing. Bronze is where God's judgment deals with sin. Only then can a person enter the pure and holy presence of God. What's interesting is there are no bronze furnishings in the heavenly temple that we read about in Revelation. There's no bronze, there's no silver, there's only gold, and there's crystal. And there are stones, precious stones, right? Precious stones, crystal, and gold. No bronze, no silver. So what is this sea of glass about? Okay, one of the things we can deduce is that it's not about judgment. Okay, so it's not about judgment for sin. It's not about judgment. So there isn't any judgment connected with this as far as our sin goes. It's a sea that's made out of crystal, no bronze. There's also fire inside of this sea. One of the things I want to bring up is something that I had never really considered before when it comes to us being raptured. In my imagination, when people would talk about being raptured or being caught up, I thought immediately that we go from here to being in God's presence, like instantaneously. But that isn't how temples work. Okay, so and that doesn't happen for anybody. Nobody. I don't care if you're a first rapture, second or third rapture person. I don't care if you're a martyr or somebody, who's part of the God-fearers that are going to be saved when Christ returns. I don't care who you are. If you want to get into the temple, you have to go through the door. So when John sees a door opened in heaven, he's seeing a door, and you have to go through a door. But if we're talking about a temple, especially the heavenly temple, we don't know all the details about what this temple is until you actually read through the whole book, pretty much, of Revelation. You got to read through the whole book. At least to chapter 15 before you even find out about this thing right here. And the idea of there being the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven. That God is in the temple part of this tabernacle, which is a temporary building. And there is an outer court where this sea of glass with fire is located. And the only way to get into being with God in his holy temple is you have to go through the door. And before you can pass through the door, you have to get to the sea of glass. And I'm going to suggest that the sea of glass, it's where we encounter the Bema seat. This is the judgment for Christians. Okay, it's not about condemnation. There's no condemnation. But there is a judgment where we're going to pass through fire in order for our works to be disclosed, what they are made out of. So we're going to look at kind of an obscure passage here. It's in Numbers 31, verses 23 and 24. What we're talking about is the purification of things so that you can basically come into the camp, okay? So Numbers 31, verses 23 and 24. Everything that can withstand the fire must be put through the fire, and it will be clean. But it must still be purified with the water of purification. And everything that cannot withstand the fire must pass through the water. On the seventh day, you are to wash your clothes, and you will be clean. And after that, you can enter the camp, supposedly 8th day. So I've talked a lot about 7 days with an 8th day, where there is a process that's happening to believers before they're actually brought into God's temple on the 8th day. This sea of glass right here, I believe, is where our works are going to pass through the fire. Let's take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and straw, each man's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work which any man has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. But if any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. An associated passage is in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive good or evil according to what he has done in the body. That word appear actually is the Greek word which means where something is made manifest. We will all be manifested. Who we are as people is going to show up. And in order for people to enter into God's temple, I'm talking about believers here, in order for us to go into God's presence, we're going to pass through the fire. And what's left, what we have to offer God, our works that are surviving, are also going to be purified in the water. Again, let me go ahead and read this passage in Numbers 31. We'll just start with 21. And Eleazar the priest said to the men of war who'd gone to battle, "This is the statute of the law which the Lord has commanded Moses. Only the gold and silver and bronze and iron and tin and lead, everything that can stand the fire, you shall pass through the fire, and it shall be clean. Nevertheless, it shall also be purified with the water of impurity. And whatever cannot stand the fire, you shall pass through water. And you must wash your clothes on the 7th day, and you shall be clean, and afterward you shall come into the camp." So when we as believers go into God's heavenly temple, the first place we're going to show up is not there in front of God's throne. It's in the outer court. And we're going to go through this sea of fire, water and fire. It's not for judgment. It's not for sin. This is where our works are going to be purified. This isn't about us being purified. It's our works, the things that we've done. The things that we've done that are permanent, that can withstand the fire, are going to withstand the fire. We're going to be rewarded, and everything else is going to be purified with the water. This is the first thing that we encounter when we get into heaven. After that, we can go into God's presence. We can go into God's presence after that. To sum it all up, Revelation is a temple story. This right here is going to show up in an earthly temple of God. Okay, an earthly temple of God. That's going to be in part 2. So I hope you'll stick around for that. Leave a comment in the comment section. We'll see you on the next video. Till then, have a blessed day.